So this weekend does mark the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, which is that terrible moment in Selma when a group of people gathered to peacefully march for voting rights to Montgomery, and they were beaten by police, brutally stopped in their tracks. And this brought attention to this little town, to the rest of America, which had not necessarily been aware. And some of you will remember having seen that on television. It was a crucial moment in the civil rights struggle, and it is a particularly precious moment to Unitarian Universalists because two of our small community were killed when they went to Selma in response to Dr. Martin Luther King's call. Please come, religious leaders, religious people, please come and join us on this march. Were any of you there? Did any of you go to Selma? But I know this congregation was very involved with the civil rights movement. The two people who died who were Unitarian Universalists are Viola Liuzzo of Michigan. She was a laywoman, and the Reverend James Reeb, who had worked in Boston and was from the D.C. area. They were both young, idealistic, and died just in this participation. Of course, many, many more African Americans were battered and imprisoned and harmed and murdered in the Jim Crow South and, of course, all over this country. The terrible legacy of slavery and racism that we live with yet today. So there's this enormous group of UUs in Selma this weekend taking a commemorative tour and engaging in a lot of reminiscing and nostalgia, much of it in the context of worship. I'm very grateful, as I know you are, thank you, grateful to all of those who show up for the work of social change. It is particularly dramatic when someone in your own community dies. I wasn't born yet in 1965, so in some ways this feels like a generational exercise for me. It's a very boomer-centric, and the greatest generation as well, as they remember being there and having caught the spirit of social justice in that moment. And we talk a lot about remaining relevant for today and staying connected to what is going on today, how to be good allies today to the African American community and all oppressed people, following that statement that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. But something I notice arising at this moment too is something that we struggle with a lot in our movement, and that is that false dualism between political and spiritual. There are folks in our movement who bristle at the thought of any God language in our congregations because they came of age in a very strongly humanistic era, and there was none of that religious stuff, and they don't have time for spirituality. And if you say we're going to enter into prayer, they think, oh God, not that again, because this is about action and this is about intellectual engagement. And then you have the folks on the other side of the spectrum, again, a false dualism, but we do personally tend to be drawn to one or the other end of the spectrum of engaged or contemplative. Those people who say, we're too political. This is not a spiritual community that is the arm of the Democratic Party. We've got to get out of all these politics. But the thing is, as we think about commitment this month, neither of those things can exist healthily and in a whole way without the other. Those who try to engage in the work of social change, who are not grounded in the spiritual practices of compassion and usually some kind of meditation or thought process or prayer that helps remind them of the hope and the love that we are grounded in, that is the center of our faith, they can't keep doing the work over a sustained period of time without becoming incredibly bitter and angry and discouraged. And then the spiritual person who enters into the mystery of God's love and who spends a lot of time cultivating peacefulness will necessarily eventually be drawn beyond what A. Powell Davies called the concerns of their own skins and want to share and create a world in which that peacefulness and that wholeness and that sense of personal integration is something that more people experience. That's what love does. We experience it, and then we want to share it. Love that remains by itself has no meaning. Reading the coverage of Selma, of the Selma commemoration going on, and seeing my UU colleagues' comments on Facebook, where everything happens nowadays, it occurred to me that one thing that we can all tell anyone who asks about Unitarian Universalism is that we are not very concerned with the salvation of the individual soul, because we're really sure that our souls are safe. Our souls are safe. But we're much more concerned with the salvation of the community, of all of us. What is it that can save us all? So that's a little tidbit for your elevator speech, should anyone ask. You can say, our Universalist heritage teaches us that we're safe, we don't need to be saved, we're loved as we are, sinful and all, but we are concerned with the salvation of all. You can't save one without being worried about everyone, being able to live freely, being able to live with dignity. That's where we get on the front lines. That's our evangelical work. And so that false dualism of political and spiritual, as it plays out in the movement, I hope we will mature beyond that and integrate that. But there's another false dualism. There's three I want to talk about today. There's a false dualism that can play out on the congregational level too, but in a slightly different form. And it comes when we think of church life, our involvement in the local congregation, in that either-or way, which is I am either coming to be peaceful and attend to my individual spiritual care and life, or I'm going to get involved with church politics, right? My word for church politics is leadership. It's actually not a bad thing. Church politics means the involvement of running the place, which gets us into messy relationships, which gets us into more conflicts than I generally have when I'm just attending to my own spiritual life. So it's like Rebecca Parker's essay that Roy just read part of. That the individual is important, but it's within community that the individual most flourishes. And we really have enormous demands being made of us in this time, in this era. The fact is that any of us who comes to church over a long period of time to have a private spiritual experience and does not get involved in the life of the community is participating as a consumer. I've done that myself. I'm not putting it down like it's something I've never done. I understand that it's something that, we are all prone to doing that. I have, for instance, joined over my summers when I've had long times off, I've become part of a church community where I'm showing up for me. I'm showing up for me, and then after a period of weeks, the people are like, hey, she's been coming back, because I haven't told them who I am. And they're like, oh, and they go, oh, do you want to join the choir? That's usually the first thing because I sing really loud. And I do, I make an offering, I always make an offering, but after a while, I will tell you something. The loneliness of pursuing spiritual closeness to God while in the midst of community is actually very painful. So I understand that can be an experience of those who come to this church or any church where I'm also the minister. I understand that because I've experienced it God actually draws us into community for a reason, and that is to make of us a people, which is something that can't happen if I go to a church and say, what's in it for me? Do I like the sermons? Do I like the music? Do I like the Sunday school program for my kids? And I assess it just from that point of view. That's actually inimical to what church exists to do. The church is, at its very core, a voluntary organization. Now, you know this because you're here today, and this is a small congregation where most everybody is involved in leadership on some level or volunteerism. But I want to point out to you, in case you were wondering, or in case you have those days, which I'm sure you do, where you tear out your hair and you say, I wish I could just go and sit and receive the spiritual nurturing that I want and need. But I have to contribute. I have to be involved. I have to be on a committee. I have to go to a ministry team meeting tonight, even though it's below zero, and I can barely get out of my driveway. I want to explain to you, in case you didn't know, my dear people, that the voluntary nature of the church isn't because at its founding, the church didn't have money to pay staff and professionals to do everything for them. That's not why. It's because, in our tradition anyway, the people who gathered the church understood that to give away the authority to run the place was theologically a problem. That it basically said that they were giving away the authority to develop themselves religiously to someone who was going to make all the important decisions for them. So the voluntary nature of the church came about as a theological commitment to the way that the people are the church, not the way the hierarchical or paid professional runs the church. So the way that we create connections and community and become a community is to not be a service provider, but to be the community, to provide services to each other. I hope I'm making some sense there. Again, it's so obvious, but we have to remind ourselves, especially at stewardship time, that it's not something by accident, that we're counting on the people to be the church and pay for the church. That's the big secret of church life. Guess what? You get to pay for it and do all the work. It's the only institution that's going to say that to you with love and excitement. Guess what? You get to do that. Because the power of that is inestimable. So, the other false dualism that comes up when we think about that, and the last one I want to address with you, is that money and religion are this nasty pair, very ugly bedfellows. And it's kind of yucky to talk about money in church. I always think of Maggie Smith with her best Empress Dowager face, if you watch Downton Abbey, with one of her comments, don't you be defeatist, dear. It's very middle class. Don't talk about money in church, dear. It's dreadfully middle class, or whatever, Attendance in church on Stewardship Sundays is traditionally so low that ministers get together and we talk about, how can we sneak a sermon topic into the newsletter that won't give away that we're going to talk about the canvas, and somebody was suggesting, just call it come to church anyway, or just say sex. The title of the sermon is sex, and everyone will come and you can, just say, sorry, I have to talk about stewardship. The sex sermon will come out some other time, So this false dualism of money and church is such a shame because, and this is a beautiful quote by Edward Hayes, money is a sacrament in which we say, this is me. This is my sweat and toil. Money is urgently relevant to everything we do together. It's a necessary living symbol of how we are literally spending our lives. So it is one of the most spiritual realities that we deal with every day, every time we contribute financially. You are giving your life force to that which you hold most dear. I was fantasizing this past week about what this congregation could be, and I saw it crowded, and I saw it with programming like the 92nd Street Y in New York City with forums and all kinds of opportunities for the community to come in and learn. I saw it with a satellite program in Lynn, with a kind of broad humanistic but spiritual worship program, an academy for the spirit. I saw it not about getting more UUs, because I think that's not really a goal that works for any of our congregations. What really works is when we say we want to promote our values in the world. We want to infect the world with our Unitarian Universalist values of inclusion, dignity, communal salvation. I wish so much that we could change the perspective of religion in the world as, oh yeah, those are those people who believe a set of creeds and have a God in the sky who has a long beard, and Jesus is his only son, and you go to hell if you don't believe these things. I can't believe that that's still the public perception of religion. On one hand, that's really depressing. On the other hand, it's like, awesome mission field for us, in which we have not succeeded yet. Okay? And we have a mission field. It is not a selling point to say, we want you to be part of our denomination. You might be a UU and not know it. Doesn't really work. But you can look at people and say, you care about the same things I do? We do? Please become part of this community so we can save the world together. We know you're already personally saved. I don't need to get into that. But we have to get honest at UCGL about how we're operating financially. I mean, I know we're working on that. We are using our disbursement of our wonderful endowment to operate our church. That's what we do with that money that we get. The pledges of the congregation so far, or last year anyway, in the last many years, has provided about 10%. 11 actually, okay, it's a little better than 10%. 11% of what we need, what we spend to run our church, to run our program. I want to tell you a story about the mixed blessings of a large endowment. It's from one of my favorite short stories by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. It's called The Foster Portfolio. And this story is told from the perspective of a contact man in an investment firm. He gets called to the house of a guy named Herbert Foster, and this house is not impressive. It's just like a little, very modest home. And the narrator says, Herbert Foster was a $6,000 a year man if I ever saw one. This was written in the 1950s, so you can adjust for inflation. And he feels like his time is wasted, but he feels like it's a courtesy call. He's going to get in and out as fast as possible. And, by all means, hold on to that $350 worth of government bonds until they mature, and that'll give you a nice little nest egg. And he's like inching his way out the door because he's not going to get a big commission from this guy. But little Herbert Foster, who's a nervous type, sends his tired wife off to the kitchen to brew some coffee, and he whisks this financial advisor into his bedroom and carefully shuts the door. And he goes to this little door that he has cut in the wall. And he reaches in past some exposed pipes to grab a sheaf of papers. And in very hushed tones, he asks the investment guy to look at these papers. Well, the advisor is trying not to roll his eyes. He agrees to look over this great fortune, and he's looking over these stock notes when he realizes, oh my God, this guy is worth, he's filthy rich. And suddenly the advisor straightens up, and he's all of a sudden Mr. Herbert Foster is Sir. But we're totally perplexed. The narrator's perplexed, and so are the readers, because Herbert Foster doesn't seem to be happy at all about his wealth. In fact, he insists on keeping his fortune a secret from his wife and child. He insists on holding on to at least 2 extra jobs, in addition to a lot of volunteer work in his church and community. His wife and son go around in beat-up clothes. He drives an old car. And he's a responsible man. He takes his wife to the movies every Thursday night and goes to church, and he plays only the most sedate classical music on the piano in his parlor. He'll never be like his own degenerate father, who we learn wasted his days in sleazy jazz joints playing red-hot jazz piano, who abandoned his wife and only son, Herbert. He, Herbert Foster, will earn every piece of bread that he puts on his family's table. Obviously, this guy has major issues around money. If it wasn't earned by the sweat of his brow, he is uncomfortable even thinking about it. Well, all the finance guys' attempts to suggest that Herbert Foster enjoy the fruits of his endowment, even at a modest enough rate to allow his son a handsome fortune when he comes of age, are met with chilly interruptions. And he's finally told, I hired you to handle my securities, not my life. Just invest it and leave me alone. And so the guy goes off to invest Herbert Foster's money, and he invests it, and pretty soon he's got this beautiful portfolio worth, in what would in this decade be multi-millions of dollars. And he's dying to show it to Herbert Foster, but he knows he'll get thrown out if he stops by the house. So he decides to surprise Herbert Foster at one of his several places of employment. So he goes to the nightclub where he knows that Herbert Foster supposedly busses tables or washes dishes or something of that nature. And he gets to this nightclub and he can't find him. So he looks around and he's asking everybody, do you know Herbert Foster? He works here. And everybody's going, I don't know. And one of the guys at the door says, I ain't ever heard of no damn Herbert Foster. So the finance man begins to have some suspicions, as we, the readers, do as well. What's going on? What could it be? Another woman? Drugs? Gambling habits? As we're left in suspense and the narrator is pondering his next move amid the Saturday night rowdies, Vonnegut writes, and then Herbert Foster, looking drab and hunted, picked his way through the crowd. His expression was one of disapproval, a holy man in Babylon. He was oddly stiff-necked and held his arms at his sides as he pointedly kept from brushing up against anyone or from meeting any of the gazes that fell upon him. There was no question that being in the place was absolute humiliating hell for him. The crowd in the rear parted for him, and I expected to see Herbert go into a dark corner for a broom or a mop, but a light flashed on at the far end of the aisle the crowd made for him, and a tiny white piano sparkled there like jewelry. As the narrator watches in total astonishment, Herbert Foster, alias Firehouse Harris, approaches the piano, carefully wipes the bench with his hanky, and sits down. He puts a cigarette in his mouth, slouches at the keyboard with a hungry glint in his eye, and, Vonnegut writes, he struck. And a spasm of dirty, low-down, gorgeous jazz shook the air, a hot, clinging wraith of the 20s. Do you get it? Herbert Foster couldn't live off the fortune left him by his father's father. It might have solved his financial problems, but it would have denied his soul something it urgently needed and craved. If he had lived off of that endowment, he would have no need for this second job, this opportunity to be his father's son 3 nights out of 7, breathing smoke and drinking gin and playing the music that he both despised and couldn't live without. He could have been rich, but he would have been half dead in his wealth. I think this story speaks a great truth to those of us who have also inherited a fortune. It seems on the face of things to be a great blessing, and it is, of course. We have the money that we need to do what we need to do, to fix the roof of when it leaks, to put in a new sound system, to have a full staff, a full-time minister. But I wonder what kind of creative possibility that fortune could be stifling. What kind of improvisation and intensity and passion if the church of today was literally more invested in itself. Money is itself an entirely neutral thing. It is energy. In its use, it can be life-giving or it can be soul-destroying. Our congregation is standing together at a crossroads of possibility. In one direction is a dangerous continued dependency on a past fortune. In the other direction is integrity, strength, and common loyalty that comes from a shared commitment to stewardship, to giving today, to our needs and dreams of today, so that we can have a sexier and hotter tomorrow, if you think of it musically, and like Herbert Foster's jazz piano, or even just a more diverse improvisational spirit. Shared investment, just like shared work and volunteerism, creates very powerful bonds of community in a way that living together off an endowment never can. So let's see how we can do in the future integrating these false dualisms. Political action and religion are not an inappropriate team, nor are private spirituality and community involvement in church leadership. Money and faith are also a perfectly matched duo, as each inspires and fuels the other to manifest hope and goodness in the self, the community, and the world. May we move from separation and false dualism to the beauty of integration, collaboration, and hot jazz.